The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Can Canada's relationship with Indigenous people rebuild while a colonial-era legislation remains in place? I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Tonight, we continue looking at Canada's evolving relationship with Indigenous peoples by revisiting a conversation about the federal law known as the Indian Act. The Indian Act was introduced way back in 1876. It's still the major piece of legislation that defines the terms of how the Canadian government interacts with First Nations. It allows the government to control land, resources, education, and more. Since this panel aired in 2019, the federal government dissolved the Department of Indian Affairs and created two new departments with separate ministers. One, Crown, Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, and two, Indigenous Services Canada. While the Indian Act has been amended a number of times, it's still in place and is seen by many as an obstacle to progress. Here's that conversation from 2019.
I want to start by quoting the first Prime Minister of Canada, Sir John A. Macdonald, who in the year 1887 declared, "The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change." That is quite some statement when looked at 150 years later, or whatever the math is on that. What were the main, Bob, I'm going to go to you first, the main features of the legislation that Sir John A. was referring to? What did he have in mind?
Well, the Indian Act was ultimately designed to assimilate Indians into the political and economic mainstream of the country. And so that's really what he was after. There's a great book by a professor out at UBC, Paul Tennant, and in his book he says that we didn't conclude treaties in British Columbia. The common theory is we'd ran out of money to continue financing these treaties, but Tennant argues it was this whole idea of assimilation was supposed to kick in. And if they assimilate, then we don't have to do new treaties. If they assimilate, we don't have to honor historic treaties. And so that's what John A., I think, was looking to accomplish with.
Give us some examples of the kind of control that the federal government had over people's lives courtesy of the Indian Act.
There was so many different examples. Women who married non-Indian men would lose their status, where men who married non-Indian women, those women would gain their status. Banning of potlatches and powwows and other cultural ceremonies was also going to be an important piece, because it was felt if they were doing those things, they weren't assimilating and becoming like everybody else. We made them get permits to be able to actually sell things off of reserve, because Canada viewed the activity of selling and having economic activity on reserve as an affront to the assimilation process. If they have hotels and gas stations and that kind of stuff, they're never going to want to leave these places. So we actually made them get passes and permission to sell things from reserves during the heyday of assimilation.
Here it is. That's the Indian Act right there. It's only 80 pages, considering it's been around for such a long time and controls so many aspects of life in this country. It's actually not that long. I want to talk to you about Section 116, which are the truancy officer powers. Tell us about the kinds of powers that involved in the Indian Act.
So these were subsections of the Act that were actually revised out of the Act in 2014, and they were under the section called schools. And they included a power for the minister to direct any Indian child to any school of the minister's choosing. So that's the basis for the residential school system, that the minister needed the legal authority to send children to various schools. The legislation also included the power of entry into the home of a parent of a child in order to detain that child. And in the event of a truancy or an escaped child, the legislation authorized the truant officer to use whatever force was necessary to detain that child and take them back to the school.
What about the notion of registering your children as Indigenous? Is that part of this?
No, my children are Indigenous by birth, but what they were not by birth was legal status Indians. That is something that came to them at a later stage, but I still had to do the process of registering them. And I did not register them until a couple of years after 2014. Pretty recently, they became legal Indians. And it was because my friends would say, look, that would never happen. The police would never come to your door to take your children. But, they did in the past. It had, in fact, happened. The Holocaust did, in fact, happen. Residential schools was a real thing. And so I'm not the only one. I'm sure that there are many, many other Indigenous parents, Indian parents out there who, given the choice, would choose to not register their children as Indians. Of course, that section of the Indian Act has been eliminated now for about 5 years. But nevertheless, I think it's still something that I think Indigenous parents have to think about that other parents don't.
You've got kids?
I have 4 kids, yeah.
Did you think about this, as Douglas just suggested?
Well, I didn't have the option, I didn't believe I had the option to not register my children as status Indians because the way I grew up, we were just told we needed to register our children upon birth because assimilation and missionization had such a strong hold on the Dene and Cree communities in Alberta and the Northwest Territories. I did automatically register my children at birth because I believed at the time that I had no choice but to do that because I believed that they wouldn't get access to their non-insured health benefits and their education and all the things we were told intergenerationally that we had to get. And as a result of that, as I took my children home from the hospital when they were each born, I always felt whenever the health nurse would come or somebody else would knock at the door that I always felt like there was a possibility that my children were going to get taken. And I still live with that lingering irrational, or maybe it's rational fear that my children are going to get taken away from me because we're Native.
What year were your kids born?
In the 90s and
In the 90s.
early 2000s.
So that's not that long ago. You had a fear that the state would come and take your children because of your background.
Either through child welfare or education, absolutely. I still think that. When I see kids sleeping in, the family room or something, I think, oh, you shouldn't sleep in there because child welfare is going to come and take you away because I'm not housing you properly.
And that fear emanates from this act right here.
Absolutely. Well, all of my mother's siblings went to residential school. Most of my younger siblings went to residential school. My younger siblings either went to residential school or were taken in the scoop.
Mm-hmm. So this is hardly an academic discussion for you and your family.
Absolutely not. My children and my siblings' children are the first generation of children in our family not to be taken and forcibly sent to residential school.
I'm a little speechless at the moment. Okay, we're going to learn a lot in the next little while. Russ, many of the aspects of this law, and Douglas just told us about one section that is no longer there, many aspects of the Indian Act have been amended. What do you think of the Act as it exists today?
It's still pretty much the same as it has been since 1876. They've relaxed it a little bit in the 1951 amendments, where what Bob was talking about, the banning of ceremonies. Actually, they stole a lot of our material culture from 1927 to 1951. We couldn't have lawyers representing our land rights. They relaxed that a bit in the 1951 amendments, but and they have amended it. They've basically been incrementally developing other First Nations legislation under Section 9124 of the Constitution Act 1867, where the federal parliament has exclusive legislative authority over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. So that's how the Indian Act was passed, was under that constitutional head of power. And now they have the First Nations Land Management Act, where you can opt out of the land sections of the Indian Act into that. So they are encouraging bands, which are also creatures of the Indian Act, to basically break up Indigenous nations into bands. Those are still in place. So basically the colonial system that Canada has been operating under for, since Confederation really, is still in place. So the amendments really haven't changed the fundamental purpose of the act.
While we're on this, that's what I want. Thank you, Sheldon. I want to get a sense from all of the guests here today. Who thinks the Indian Act needs to be scrapped entirely? Hands up, please. 2 hands. How about just amended and made better? Hands up, please. You didn't vote. Where are you?
Well, because I think there's another option.
Which is what?
I think the Indian Act has to remain in place until each band decides to develop a self-determination plan on how to get out of it. You just can't pull out of it because it affects every aspect of your life, from womb to tomb, particularly for people who are living on reserve. So they need options to opt out that aren't prescribed by Ottawa, and that's the problem. Is Ottawa offers, they said if you want out of the Indian Act or go beyond the Indian Act, you have to accept our other legislation under our policies like the self-government policy or the land claims policies, or the legislation that I referred to, the Land Management Act or other federal legislation.
For those who want it for those who want it ended altogether, does his approach make any sense to you?
Well, I think, ending it doesn't mean just throwing people out into the country of Canada without any acknowledgement or transition plan for where we've been. I fully agree with my colleague here that there has to be a plan that happens, but that has to be through a process of autonomy and self-determination.
So some kind of transition.
That has to happen by the communities, and without that colonial piece that's controlling what people do. And that's really what the fundamental issue of the Indian Act is that it by nature impedes and prevents autonomy and self-determination, and something else has to happen, because I don't think we can go on this way.
So Bob, just so we're clear, if Justin Trudeau came to you tomorrow and said, I'm going to scrap the Indian Act and it's going to be done by the end of June, would that be a good thing?
I don't think so, and it's based on what we've just heard. To scrap it would create a whole set of other problems, and really a policy vacuum. That's what they're sort of referring to, and so. And then the next step, though, is what do we do to fill that policy vacuum? And that's a self-determination, self-government, self-reliance piece, which I think is totally achievable. You look at the Niska Nation, who have gotten out of under the Indian Act. They transferred title of the reserves. They got rid of the bands. They've got a larger land base and resources and jurisdiction. They actually agreed to pay taxes as part of their treaty settlement package. But what it's given them, instead of the Indian Act, is an ability to be self-determining. Nobody in Ottawa gets to tell us who our people are anymore. Self-governing, we're going to govern ourselves in a way that makes sense. So, they brought in some traditional governance. Their government is called the Niska government, and it's based on their cultural law and practice. And then the really important piece, and I think it's what was being alluded to, is the self-reliance. We want to be able to pick ourselves up and look after ourselves, participate in the political and economic mainstream, but in the way that protects our cultures and our societies and our nations.
You've heard, Douglas, a few different approaches here. What do you like?
Well, I think that these are all of these approaches are right, but I think what it belies is that the ease with which people talk about the problems facing Indigenous settler relations, as though this one thing is somehow responsible for all the ills in the world. The very real fears that Professor Stewart was talking about her children have nothing to do with the Indian Act. Those are regarding provincial child welfare laws. But they're nevertheless part of the pervasive web of regulations that affect Indigenous people. I just think that there is always going to be some kind of a legislative relationship between Indigenous people and the state. There always has to be, otherwise the assimilation project has succeeded. And so we need to face that reality, and then we need to ask, what are the actual problems facing Indigenous people, and how can we fix them? Starting with, should we get rid of the Indian Act, is not a productive place to begin.
Okay, humor me for a second then, okay? Because 50 years ago, there was some considerable discussion at the highest levels in the country about doing just that. And this was when the current Prime Minister's father was in power. I want to read an excerpt here from Harold Cardinal, who was a Cree teacher, political leader, negotiator, lawyer. He was the author of something called The Unjust Society, The Tragedy of Canada's Indians. And again, this goes back to 1969. The Indian Act is discriminatory from start to finish, but it is a lever in our hands and an embarrassment to the government, as it should be. No just society, and no society with even pretensions to being just, can long tolerate such a piece of legislation. But we would rather continue to live in bondage under the inequitable Indian Act than surrender our sacred rights. Anytime the government wants to honor its obligations to us, we are more than ready to help devise new Indian legislation. I'm going to go back to you on this one. If that was the case 50 years ago, when Pierre Trudeau said to his Indian Affairs Minister Jean Chrétien, a future Prime Minister, let's get rid of this thing, why hasn't this happened in 50 years?
Well, they proposed repealing the Indian Act and amending the Constitution to remove any reference to Indians and lands reserved to Indians. That's Section 9124. But the reason why the rejection of repealing the Indian Act happened across the country was Indian leaders and Indian chiefs, as we were called Indians at the time. We're using Indigenous now. It's the Indian Act.
That word was not used 50 years ago.
No, it was not.
Right.
And in there, basically, they said not until our Indian rights and our Indian land rights are resolved, what they called claims. They said we don't want to get rid of the Indian Act because it's the only place that recognizes that we are distinct from Canadians.
Suzanne, does
and
that make sense to you?
That was part of the Indian Act, was to remove the legal distinctions between Indians and Canadians.
I see. Does that make sense to you as to why this act is still in place?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the critical reasons. And I think another reason, and there's many because it's multifaceted, the other reason is the Indian Act ensures that the government and Canada and multinational corporations continue to have unfettered access to the natural resources of Canada.
So if there were good faith on behalf of the Crown to create a new piece of legislation that would guarantee all of the things that you've just referred to, you're shaking your head.
It's a constitutional issue. I don't think you can come up with Section 9124 specific legislation that's going to solve the problem. That's what the new Constitution, Section 35, was supposed to do in the 1980s when they had the first ministers' conferences on Aboriginal matters. That was supposed to be a political agreement between the representatives of the national organizations on what the meaning of Aboriginal treaty rights were in Section 35, but the Prime Minister and the Premiers ran out the clock, and then it turned to the courts to start interpreting Section 35, and then they started offering this self-government policy for negotiating what the powers of self-government are, but they're municipal-type powers. And it was Jean Chrétien, Mr. White Paper, who, as Prime Minister, who imposed that policy in 1995 of what they call the inherent right policy. And that's the problem, is you really have to talk about the constitutional and now international issues, because you've got the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples coming in with minimum standards, which are higher than what Canada's legislation has been implementing.
So can I just hop in here? Because I want to address a piece of Suzanne and Bob's argument, both of which have to do with land. And the Indian Act is not the legislation that creates reserves, right? And what has to happen, well, so it doesn't actually create each individual reserve, right? It creates the power, it doesn't anymore. So my point just is
you two hang on, you two disagree on this pretty fundamental point here.
Well, my point just is that there's a limited land base for First Nations. And until Indigenous people have greater access to the lands, as Professor Stewart was saying, we can't develop economically, that's a piece that has to be addressed. And that's something that is outside of the Indian Act per se, because it's about access to Crown lands, and most of those Crown lands are in provincial hands, which means that this can't just be a federal government solution. There is going to have to be a constitutional piece, because the provinces are going to have to chip in order to provide a land base for Indigenous peoples to develop on economically.
And that's exactly what Arthur Manuel, the late Arthur Manuel, said in his books, Unsettling Canada and the Reconciliation Manifesto. He said land is the issue. And you're not going to solve all these other problems about poverty, jurisdiction, self-government and that, until you address having sufficient land bases for people to be economically viable.
Okay, but I got to go back here for a second. I got to go back. You just said that the Indian Act is not the act that created
It created reserves originally, but it does not enumerate the specific land base of each and every individual reservation in Canada. That was my point.
Equal time for Bob on this.
Oh, I was just more thinking about the land comments, actually. In terms of reserve, we need to get away from the reserve system, and that's what NISCA was able to do in their treaty negotiation.
And in order to do that, they needed a piece of provincial and federal legislation that set out the powers and provided...
And they needed to agree to extinguish their Aboriginal title, which is really unfair.
Over a large portion of their territory, yes.
Okay, I'm going to take a step back here.
All right.
The person who produced this segment, Leanne Kotler, was in Northern Ontario a week ago. She had a conversation with somebody, and we were going to protect that person's name and where they live because we don't want to get them in any trouble. The view that was conveyed to Leanne was that this person believes the Indian Act was designed by the Government of Canada to keep the federal government transferring funds to reserves, which has, in the view of this person, become a corrupt practice because now the band councils are accountable to Ottawa instead of to their constituents. Discuss. You want to come in on that first?
Well, I think the first thing I want to say about that would be sort of a bird's eye view, is that we have to remember that part of the tools of implementing the Indian Act have been divide and conquer. And I think that's been a very successful tool of how the Indian Act has been implemented, and has created a lot of problems among Indigenous communities relationally, not just between Indigenous communities and the government, but among people within communities. It's created those divisions through these types of processes that you're talking about.
Would you say, though, it is a problem in this country that some leadership in some band councils feel more obliged to Ottawa than their constituents because of the nature of the financial arrangement?
Well, I think that's sort of the way that the government has set it up in order to create these types of conflicts and these problems. I mean, the Indian Act, essentially everything, including the example you're talking about, has set up a scenario by which people can choose to assimilate if they follow the legislation, or if they don't want to assimilate, the other choice by following the legislation is to die. You either die or you assimilate.
Two lousy options.
And you have no other options. And you die fighting.
The British, it's based on the British colonial system of indirect rule. They use the chief and council system. Ottawa does control them. They've signed contracts to deliver programs and services for Ottawa. That's the difference between 1969 and now. In 1969, most of our communities weren't delivering those services. Now they are, to billions of dollars worth of services across the country. And that's where the control comes in over the chief and council system. And there's a big schism between the members and the leaders because of that.
Is there an unholy alliance there, if you like, Bob?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's the problem that I've been sort of working on for my life, is to try and change this system that's being described here. And I think we've got an opportunity right now with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to really go after it in a way that I think needs to happen. And if we take the principles of free, prior, and informed consent, they have to be free from coercion, from influence, which they're not underneath the Indian Act chief system. We can go cut deals with chiefs on pipelines or other sort of mega projects, but I think there's a real problem there with Canada has created these institutions which are now approving the removal of people's lands and resources, and so that. That's, I think, the way that you really just got to boil it down. And I think the time right now, and Minister Carolyn Bennett of Indigenous and Northern Affairs has been traveling the last 4 years to figure out how do we make this transition from the Indian Act to something else in a way that doesn't compromise principles and, do some of the negative adverse effects. I think we're in a pretty good space for that to happen right now. But
I think there's issues with her approach myself.
Yeah, and it's the same, Russ has said it over and over again, it's always that government interference piece, and it has to be driven by the people in the communities. And in my view, that can't be led by the chief and council.
No.
That has to be led by the people, whether they go back to a hereditary system, which is where I come from, a hereditary chieftainship system, or they stay with an elected something maybe you call it something different, has to be driven by the community people, not by Indian Affairs, not by the band chiefs and councils who are probably going to get the money to do all of this work.
In fact, in the Haudenosaunee communities around here, they used the Indian Act to forcibly put elective systems in and ignored the Haudenosaunee Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers and systems.
Which is a hereditary
A
system.
hereditary, well, yes. Well, not so much hereditary because it goes through the women. The women choose who the leaders are in that. So it's a matrilineal system. And they padlocked the Six Nations in 1927, I believe it was. That's when they made the amendments to the Indian Act to make it more restrictive. Was because Discahe was at the League of Nations trying to get recognition for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy.
I haven't heard from Douglas on this yet.
So I think this is related to the larger problem. So the Indian Act structures the political relationship so that the chiefs are accountable to Ottawa, not to the people, which is the opposite of the way a political structure is supposed to work. And one of the reasons that it works that way is because First Nations governments don't get to do the fundamental thing that governments do, which is to tax lands, resources, and people to raise money to spend it on their citizens. And until First Nations have access to a larger resource base, which they can tax to then spend on their citizens, the chiefs will never be accountable to the people. They will only be accountable to Ottawa. So again, it's tied to the question of land and economics.
How can you imagine that working differently and better?
Well, I can't really because I'm not part of a community that's deciding how we're going to do that differently. And I think I really want to go back to what was said earlier, and that is that it's the communities that need to be given that autonomy to be able to make those decisions about how this is going to be handled now and what type of new legislation is going to be and how it's going to be informed. It's going to be informed by the United Nations declaration. It's going to be informed by the TRC calls to action. It's going to be informed by the great laws of the Haudenosaunee, or by the Dene laws, or by whatever the community's laws are.
And that's it for tonight's Agenda in the Summer. Tomorrow, we'll look back at our 2018 conversation with author Tanya Talega about her powerful Massey lectures on Indigenous youth in crisis. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. And we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.